evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd ask you to remember two words that you may seem or may think are strange words for a talk about energy, but I'd like you to remember the words elasticity, and I'd like you to remember the words cognitive capacity. Because as the discussion moves on this evening, the ability of our minds to take in the critical elasticity issues around energy and the ability of our minds to totally grasp and come round the circumference of all the energy opportunities and energy challenges that we face are both critical. So we'll begin with those two words, elasticity and cognitive capacity, and we'll come back to them a little bit later. But let's jump right into it. How the world has changed in just a few short years. And I don't say this to make a political statement. I say this to describe the reality that is. Who would have thought just a few years ago that China would ignore Vietnam's 200-mile offshore limit and bring a flotilla of ships to support and protect a drilling rig that would deliberately invade what is recognized as international borders worldwide of 200-mile offshore limits? Or who would have thought that fishermen from the Philippines, who have been fishing for hundreds of years in and around various skulls and rocks in the South China Sea, are basically physically bumped out of their fishing zones by Chinese fishermen who are backed by Chinese Marines in the same area? Who would have thought that after the Winter Olympics, we'd see a token invasion of Crimea and a complete takeover in a matter of days, with essentially a non-response from the rest of the world? Who would have thought a country like Ukraine could collapse so quickly into dissent, disagreement, and dysfunction over a matter of weeks, not months or years? Who would have thought that Boko Haram operate without resistance, at will, fearing nothing, as they go about murdering and conducting the rapacious behavior across the Nigerian countryside, where a phone call to the local militia before they arrive at a village results in the local militia vacating their post as the Boko Haram arrive? Who would have thought the citizens of Brazil by the millions would stand up and protest at the expenditures on the World Cup and the Summer Olympics of 2016 because of their deep, deep concern at the social inequities where so many have been left behind in Brazil's economic rise? And so I could go on and on, ladies and gentlemen. But what I'm describing, and if we look at the Middle East, makes the case entirely. We have entered in a few short years an era, not a period, an era of what I would consider lawlessness, disrespect, parochial nationalism, selfish kleptocracies that may, in name only, think of themselves as democratic, and authoritarian regimes that really, frankly, care not what democratic regimes think about. And without casting aspersions at the current president, the previous president, the president before that, we are where we are. And the world has entered a period of massive uncertainty, incredible ambiguity, and ever greater risk. And that risk comes home to you and each member of your family and each member of your community, and I'm included in that you, even though I'm not from Colorado, but I'm part of the American fabric, and we are all part of a changing landscape at a global level that affects the price we pay for the gasoline that we take for granted, and the price we pay for the electrons when prices can only seem to rise, and affect half of our nation in dire ways because of the reduction of disposable income to 50% of our families. 50% of median income that live on $50,000 or less per year. Dire ways, such as the retired gentleman who sent me a letter just before I retired from Shell Oil, as the gasoline price reached $4 a gallon in his hometown, and said, I just want you to know I've been a lifetime Shell customer. I'm sitting at my kitchen table. I'm cutting my blood pressure medicine in half so it will last twice as long because I can't buy your gas and also pay for my medicine. I hope you don't lose a customer. Sincerely yours. And signed his name. That's dire. It's worse today than it was in 2008. Because we still live on, ladies and gentlemen, 8 million barrels a day of imported oil. And when we think about the Middle East and imported oil, and we think about in Libya, a general this week on a tirade took over the parliament, aggravating what has been an ongoing civil war. We see an election in Iraq where the Shia have greatly outnumbered the Sunni in terms of elected representatives, which will only incite further the Sunni hatred of the Shia and the ungovernability of Iraq. We see Iran, maybe you saw the 60 Minutes program on Sunday, we see Iran as a country we don't understand, that we've ignored largely for most of modern time, since the 1970s, for good reason perhaps, but now have mortal hatred between the countries. And can we, will we, should we do a nuclear deal with this country? Can it be trusted? And we see so much other evidence of where we get our energy from: Venezuela, Nigeria. Fortunately, we have Canada and Mexico. But when we look out there and we see what we're up against from a global geopolitical standpoint, the fact that we still need 8 million barrels a day, every day, to get through the day. When you hear or read the headline messages that we're headed for independence of energy, read the whole article. The headline editor doesn't have to read the article to make the headline. But any journalist worth his or her salt will tell the whole story. Energy independence is and will remain an aspiration. We can't get there from here on the path that we're on, despite the embellishment of the stories by the industry who are looking for more investors, by a certain group of elected officials who are looking for re-election, by various and sundry other special interest groups that think it's in their best interest that we be energy independent. But we can't get there from here on the path that we are on. You have the controversy of fracking in this state with a huge, highly funded yes, no campaign for local communities coming up. in the fall election? Will communities have the ability to ban fracking in Colorado? And what are the implications of that? How wise is that? Or how unwise is that? And so when we look out into the future and we think about our children and our grandchildren, I would describe energy today as fragmented as to supply source, fragmented as to governance of how energy gets produced, as dysfunctional in terms of public policy setting around energy at the federal level in particular. It is an absolute, utter disgrace to what democracy stands for that the Shaheen-Portman bill on energy efficiency did not get a vote on the floor of the Senate a week ago. A disgrace. A disgrace to the majority leader, a disgrace to the minority leader, a disgrace to the American people that our elected representatives that work for us couldn't even pass a bill that everyone agrees to in private. Because of the bullheaded blockheadedness of both sides. Because Harry Reid wouldn't allow any amendments. And without amendments, the Republicans would not vote for cloture. The Republicans said, just let us vote on the amendments. You'll probably win. In other words, we'll lose the amendments, but give us the vote. That's what we're here for. We represent a lot of constituents in this country. Let us have a vote on amendments. Who do you think you are not to give us the right to vote on amendments? Which is what the Senate does. If we lose, we lose. But give us the right to vote on what we think is important. And then the bullheadedness of the Republicans to not be able to cope with the consequences of the bullheadedness of the Democratic majority leader. So who do you blame? I blame them both. There hasn't been an energy bill in this country, ladies and gentlemen, since 2007. While we have paid the highest prices in our lives for transportation fuels. And so you have this dysfunction at state level, confusion, at local level, a lot of give and take, and a lot of controversy all over the nation. And so where are we going? And what can our children count on? What can their children count on? And so what I'd like to get to is a fairly dramatic prediction, a fairly dramatic statement. We cannot count on federal leadership from Richard Nixon to today. That's reality. That's just the way it's been. 8 presidents promising energy independence, 21 Congresses supporting the notion, and here we are. How long ago was Richard Nixon president? And we are where we are. 8 million barrels a day of imports. More barrels a day of imports in 2014 than in 1973 when Richard Nixon got started on talking about energy independence. Yes, we're producing more oil. We were at 5 million barrels a day in 2005. Now we're at 8 million barrels. We've seen an increase in natural gas production over the last 5 years. We've gone from 60 billion cubic feet a day to 70 billion cubic feet a day. But meanwhile, our electrical generation capacity is basically stable, but aging rapidly. We're going to see the decommissioning of at least 3, if not 5, nuclear power plants in the course of the next year, 18 months. We're going to see the decommissioning of approximately 100 coal plants once we get the new EPA regulations. I've talked personally with CEOs of major electric utilities, and with the anticipated new regulations on coal emissions from the EPA trying to regulate the air quality of the nation, we'll see about 100 to 150 plants go away between now and say 2016, 2017, depending on what timetable is announced by the EPA. Because these CEOs have said, with a 60, 70, 80-year-old coal plant, with all that it has done, do you really think I'm going to refacilitize that facility to reduce its pollution? The best way to reduce its pollution is just shut it down. That's what's good for shareholders. And frankly, that's what's good for clean air. Shut it down. When you ask the follow-up question, and what replaces it? Well, we'll have to buy spot market electricity. Where do you buy spot market electricity if you've got 150 plants across the nation shutting down, along with a rising number of nuclear plants shutting down? Can you rely on the wind farms, which represent about just over 2% of our supply source? The solar farms at 1%? The new gas plants in parts of the country where there are no pipelines to move gas? So we face nationally a critical set of issues in terms of where we've been. The 20th century produced the most sophisticated, complex, robust, ubiquitous, homogeneous energy system, most technologically advanced the world has ever seen. We're still relying on it in the 21st century. The only difference is it's old. There's nothing wrong with being old. Apart from the fact, you're not what you used to be. When we think about what we used to do, and that's the same with the steel in the ground, and the valves and the pipes, and the boilers, and the chimneys, and the infrastructure of the energy system. So the two items I want to get to, given that there will be no federal leadership, another election won't make a difference. Whether the Republicans win or whether the Democrats win, they've all had chances before, and they can't. Why? Because they're not there long enough. And why? Because they rely on a 2-year cycle to set their priorities. And in energy time, we need decades. Companies that invest capital in energy investments want to know over 20, 30, 40, 50 years what's the likelihood of return on their investment. And the 2-year priorities that are impacted by electoral politics at a state or a national level, such as Harry Reid's decision on Shaheen Portman, where he wants to make sure that in November of 2014, the Democrats can make the case that the Republicans are nothing but obstacles. This is about electoral politics, not about efficiency. This is trying to preserve the Senate for the Democrats. And who's the majority leader of the Democrats? Trying to preserve his own job, as a matter of fact. Because he knows, and every other Democrat knows, they're running against the grain of public opposition to an increasingly unpopular president, and the Democratic Senate is vulnerable. So the way you present the Republicans is blockheads and obstructionists. The hell with efficiency. That doesn't matter. We'll get to that later, except we won't. So the two areas. Number one, when it comes to transportation fuels, it's time to declare an end to the monopolistic control of oil. 98% of all the miles driven in this country rely on one product: oil-based gasoline and diesel fuel. We are the victims as a people of a monopolistic product supply chain that locks us in to a pricing agenda that is driven by a cartel of international exporting countries. It's not ExxonMobil or Chevron or Shell or BP or Total or ConocoPhillips. They don't set the oil price. They just produce oil. The oil price is controlled by the cartel to make sure that the money we pay As Boone Pickens would say, the $500 billion a year that we pay for imported oil keeps their regimes afloat. So we keep Venezuela afloat, we keep Saudi Arabia afloat, we keep Iraq and Kuwait, and on afloat, because it's their primary source of income. And if you see the excesses that exist in every one of those countries, thank you very much, Mr. and Mrs. America. You've paid for the excesses. And we continue to buy internal combustion engine vehicles and use more oil, more gasoline, more diesel. So let's face facts. We can't go on this way. It's eroding our capital capacity as a nation, and it's impoverishing half of the nation who can't afford it any longer. There's a famous word from Silicon Valley. Let's bring it into this monolithic business called oil products. And let's disintermediate the oil products grasp of the transportation mobility marketplace. And by disintermediation, what do I mean? I mean, let's go for product proliferation. Product proliferation that can come from oil. We won't go off oil completely. Natural gas, 5 different approaches for mobility from natural gas, which tells you how important natural gas is to the future. Compressed natural gas called CNG, liquefied natural gas called LNG, gas to liquids, which is clean diesel, called GTL. We can also make ethanol and methanol from natural gas. The chemistry is not that difficult. We can have 5 different choices for vehicles of tomorrow, from trains to trucks to automobiles and other applications, agriculture, etc., by shifting to natural gas as a set of alternative fuels that compete with oil, compete with gasoline or diesel. You can mix ethanol and methanol. Methanol costs $1.10 a gallon wholesale. $1.10 a gallon. Suppose you could buy a product that was 20% gasoline, 80% methanol. You'd be paying less than $2 a gallon for fuel. And people said, we'll never pay that price again. Yes, we can. It's possible. Same with ethanol, including biomass for making ethanol and natural gas. And don't rule out electrification. We've made a lot of progress with batteries. And you may not be a fan of batteries yourself, but there are those for whom it's a perfect application for their lifestyle. I spoke at the Tesla factory last week. And when you see a Tesla being produced, and you see the fans of Tesla, the fan club of Tesla, it's quite amazing. Now, of course, you have to be able to write a check, a big check, that for the people who are buying Teslas is not a problem. They don't seem to have any difficulty holding a 6-month backlog on Tesla deliveries for people who simply write a check. You don't call up the Tesla finance company and say, how much can you loan me if you're going to buy a Tesla? There is no such finance company. But a beautiful vehicle that worked beautifully well for the niche that can afford it. And Elon Musk is determined to bring the price down to a different model where he can hit a target market in the 30,000s, not just the 90,000s or the 70,000s or the 100,000s for a vehicle. The Bolt, the Leaf, etc. But don't forget there's also hydrogen fuel cells. Toyota, this year, 2015 model year, will introduce hydrogen fuel cells to the European market, the Japanese market, and would in the US market, except there are not any hydrogen fueling stations, except in California, where they will introduce the hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. California is committed to 200 hydrogen fuel cell stations that will be built. And the hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, I think, will actually become much more popular in time than battery vehicles because you get a 400-mile range on a tank full of hydrogen. And you get all the joy of driving an electric vehicle, which is silent and powerful, just like you drive an internal combustion engine vehicle. And you fill it up with a pump. You don't plug it into a wall. And so we have this opportunity if we disintermediate. What does it take to disintermediate? It takes a slight change in what we call legal fuels. The EPA has the ability to simply authorize additional legal fuels and do whatever atmospheric testing and other testing necessary, but they'll only do it if they're required to. And we'll talk later about who will require them to. The second approach is the disintermediation of power generation. And if you want to know and understand more about the disintermediation of power generation, let me send you to the shareholder letter written by David Crane, the CEO of NRG, a large utility headquartered in New Jersey, but located in multiple states. What David Crane said to his shareholders this March in the 2013 annual report is, we have concluded that the future of power generation has to include multiple distributed sources of power generation which are not traditionally a part of a utility's business model. And because we cannot beat them at their game of local power generation at the home, at the factory, at the office, where power can be produced, we're going to join them. We will create our own business structure inside NRG to pursue electron production from distributed means. Now, what are distributed means? Solar panels, wind turbines, combined heat and power facilities, let's say in manufacturing plants that use a lot of heat. And rather than just waste that heat into the atmosphere, capture that heat to make power, electricity, by turning a turbine on site. Or some of you, and in some well-to-do neighborhoods, in gas-rich communities, many people are putting in gas generators for their own power generation to protect themselves in the event of a grid reliability issue. And grid reliability is becoming the issue of the 21st century, which is a non-story in Washington, D.C., because there is no admission, no acknowledgement of the risk to the grid. And in my private conversations with CEOs from utilities, they would say to me, John, there is such misinformation taking place in this country on grid reliability that by 2016, 2017, 2018, when the grid can't keep up, particularly in cold winter and hot summer, everybody's going to be running to their closets to not be held accountable for decisions made in the last 7-8 years on what we're doing to the reliability of the existing grid. And when we need it, it won't be there. Because the political appointees will not accept the recommendations of their staff as to the erosion of grid reliability based on the path that we're on. So disintermediation of power generation is becoming a necessity. And if you're on the fence, panels or no panels on your property, if you're on the fence as to a gas generator, no gas generator, if you're on the fence as to whether that nearby wind farm should or shouldn't be built, build everything you can that represents distributed generation, because the nuclear and fossil fuel capacity of the grid, apart from those areas where we can build new gas plants and are building new gas plants, is at serious risk. And what does that include? The Northeast, the Middle Atlantic states, and the Southeast. Because they don't have the gas pipelines. And they're not going to. Try to get a gas pipeline under the Hudson River. I tried. Absolutely not. The environmental community will not have it. Try to build a gas line to take liquefied natural gas from Boston, where they actually have a receiving terminal, down to Connecticut. Forget about it. Not going to happen. This is the most highly constructed, residentially dense population in the nation along the East Coast. It's a megalopolis from Boston to Richmond. They're not going to disrupt that for the sake of a few pipelines. In the Southeast, it's just always used coal. So there's never been a need for the pipelines. And the West Coast, you'll be okay. You've got a great utility that has adjusted to the times. You may not always think of them kindly, but they're a great utility. And I'm speaking, is it XL? Is your utility?
Yeah.
They know what they're doing. You'll be okay. So you've chosen a good, safe place to live. Except for the storms. But we have to disintermediate fuels and we have to disintermediate power generation because we're not going to get the leadership from government that focuses on 2-year cycles. That's a fact. For all the promises, for all the aspirations, for all the commitments, for all the rhetoric, it's not going to happen. Sorry. There's also no tooth fairy. Santa Claus still up in the air over that one. But that's the reality that most Americans have not come to grips with. If we haven't done it in the last 40 years, why would anyone think that, well, if we just chose Jeb Bush, if we just chose Hillary, if we had just chosen Hillary the last time, forget it. It's naive to think it because they're driven by a different set of priorities, and what you pay for fuel and what you pay for electrons and the reliability of your grid is not on their priority list. Power and control. And that's where democracy has a problem. And I said I'd come back to how are we going to make it happen? How are we going to get the EPA to make natural gas a legal fuel for automobiles, natural gas to make methanol and ethanol that we can burn in our internal combustion engine? And by the way, if you have a car that is newer than 2002 model year, you actually have a flex fuel vehicle. It's just not set up to be flex fuel, unless it says flex fuel on the fender. But you have the fueling system, and you have the protections in the vehicle with an adjustment for the fueling system to make it flex fuel. So you could use 85% ethanol, 85% methanol, and save yourself a couple of bucks a gallon for the fuel you buy for less than a $200, $300 adjustment to your fueling system. Not thousands. If you want compressed natural gas, you can spend thousands. But using liquid fuel, it's not hard. How do we make the disintermediation happen? I'm looking at you, and I'm seeing all the power of the people of this nation. And you might say, well, we're disorganized. We're not that disorganized. We are united by the gas pump. We're united by the electrical connection to the grid in our communities, in our homes. There's no reason for the prices to be what they are, given the bounty of energy that we have in this nation and in our near neighbors, Mexico and Canada. I said we can't be energy independent on the path we're on. I didn't say we can't be energy independent as North America. We have the power of democracy to utilize. 3 things we need to do. 1, need to be informed. We need to understand what is and what is possible, and to understand what is not. We take energy for granted. That's not good enough, because we're entering a different era. If we have seen the change in the international geopolitical relationships that we've seen in the last say 15 years. Those are the changes that are coming to the energy future as well, where it's going to be every person out for himself or herself, to make sure you have energy in your home, that you have fuel in your tank, because nobody's going to help you with that if we stay on the path we're on. And that's chaos. And that's a society divided by who has and who has not energy. And so it has to come to us, because we own this democracy. And being informed about reality, that's where the elasticity and the cognitive capacity comes in. The elasticity is to think in ways that our mind might not have thought before. The cognitive capacity is the ability to acquire and use more information, to grow the knowledge base that we can hold in our minds. And the elasticity and the capacity of the mind has yet to be defined. So let's use it. So being informed is number one. Number two, if people choose not to vote, I suppose that's their business. But then those people who don't vote don't get to express their point of view, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't count. Who cares what they think? If they can't show up to vote, however they vote based on what they know. They vote their heart, they vote their mind. They vote their intentions, their aspirations. But if you don't vote, you can't complain. If you don't vote, you're not a player. Countries like Australia turn out 90+%. I don't know what Colorado's statistics are, but I know in Houston, the mayor, when she was elected for her first term, got just over 50% of the 14% who showed up to vote. 14% in the city of Houston showed up to vote. She got just over 50%. It was a runoff election. So she's very grateful to 7% of the people. 7.5%. But what a disgrace. What an embarrassment. But nationally, how are we doing? We got a 2014 election. There are a lot of elections, local elections, are counting on people not showing up. Because that's the advantage. Let the rabbit choose who they want. That's where power lies. And so by not showing up to vote, we are where we are. Because quite frankly, the unpopularity of Harry Reid in Nevada, his favorables were 20% in 2010 when he was reelected. His favorables were 20% in a state that he had represented for how many decades? And the Republicans ran an opponent where some people actually told me in Nevada, if we put up a bag of rocks, the Rock would have won. But we did worse than that. We put up somebody that couldn't overcome the 80% negatives on Harry Reid. She was so bad. And the witch in Delaware, or the not a witch in Delaware. And so when people don't show up to vote, you get these kinds of candidates. So voting. And number three, if you're informed and you vote, what does that entitle you to? A say. A say with your elected representative. Because don't they want your vote? And if they know you vote, don't they recognize who's the boss? And they do. And most of the public servants that I know, most of the elected representatives I know, care deeply what you think and want to work for you, not against you. And so, with information and with voting and with interacting with your elected representative, who live in the same communities, who put on their shoes one at a time, who go to the same grocery stores, who pay the same bills we do, who don't like the high price of fuel, who don't like the lack of reliability potentially in the grid. We tell them what we need. And we hold them accountable to deliver on their promises. And we don't forget. And we don't live on a 2-year cycle. We may vote every 2 years, but that's not the cycle on which we base our lives. They may base their careers on the 2-year cycle, but that's them. We're us. We think about our children and their children, which is multi-generational, and what we need in that regard. And so let's go back to the beginning. The second thing I talked about was the geopolitical chaos that we face. We are in a new era, and that era is called take care of yourself. Every nation, take care of yourself. The international trading, the international environment is too subjective to trust. What we saw this week, yesterday, the United States government identifying by name and photograph cyber attackers in the Chinese military out to do us in. Is that an act of war? Could be. Certainly it's economic war. The situation in Ukraine and the impact on the neighboring states, where Russia's trying to protect a buffer, to protect themselves from us, because they don't trust us. And why should we? Because we don't like kleptocrats, and we don't like corruption, and we don't like non-democratic authoritarian behavior. Why should we be friends with them? They're not like us. Bush was naive as could be when he said he can look in his eyes and see his soul. I mean, give me a break. And Hillary has something to be accountable for when she stood with Medvedev and gave him one of those Staples red buttons to push on the reset of Russian relations. Push the button, Mr. Medvedev. And he did. And that was a really good thing to do, wasn't it? That solved a lot of issues for us. And so we can't be naive about this. When you work in a business that's global, the world is as it is. And some of the behaviors that I've seen and the experiences I've seen, and those who haven't seen it, I can only tell the stories. But the world is a very difficult place. And trust and respect are not high on the list of how international relations are conducted. And which president was it that said trust but verify? And we're about to do a deal with Iran, possibly, on the most important issue in the Middle East, which is nuclear weaponry. And I sat with Benjamin Netanyahu in his office about a year ago, talking about the energy future of Israel. And what could Israel do? Because it has no oil, but it has natural gas. And he wanted advice from people who know something about that as to whether he could go off oil as a nation, small state of Israel. And I said, absolutely. He said, should we produce LNG? I said, where would you produce it? He said, well, we could build a platform of floating LNG out at sea. I said, how many times do you want to build it? Because it's not a hard target to hit if somebody doesn't like you. But you can convert a nation like Israel to natural gas. They only use 800,000 barrels a day of oil. We use 20 million barrels of oil a day. And so there are all kinds of solutions there, ladies and gentlemen, but none of them are worth anything if you're not engaged, if you're not involved. And that is where I close. the elasticity of your thinking and the cognitive capacity of your understanding and your democratic behavior are the absolute solutions to the world of tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
Question about the efficiency of the current solar panels. How long before the solar panels that are being installed today are going to be obsolete?
They're obsolete when they're installed.
Say more, please.
We're putting up commercial junk, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry, but when you're buying solar panels with an efficiency rating of single digit, low double digit, up to say 15, 18%, which is about all that's available on the market today, you're buying yesterday's solar panel. Because tomorrow's solar panel hasn't been invented yet. In my book, Why We Hate the Oil Companies, I describe the solar panel of tomorrow. The solar panel of tomorrow will come from academic laboratories or research laboratories, and it would be predicated on materials never before known to man. And silicon-based panels made from sand are well known to all of us. And that's where you get the single digit or the low double digit efficiency. But with nanotechnology and the creation of new materials at the molecular level, which have yet to be named, which have yet to be produced, which have yet to be explained, we can get 35+% efficiency, and that's the trigger point. When we can produce 35% electricity efficiency from panels, we're there. Because then we'll get to 40, then we'll get to 45, then we'll get to 50%, and we're off to the races. Because nothing will be able to compete price-wise in terms of the use of coal, the use of natural gas, other than nuclear, in terms of electricity production, than panels at that level of commercial reliability. And we're not there yet. When? I don't know. Not by 2020, not by 2025, most likely. We're probably in the 2030s. And so those who are buying panels today, good luck to you.
Next question.
Yes, the issue of CO2 emissions was implicit in much of what you said, but not explicit. Would you care to comment on that?
I think the world of tomorrow, meaning the next 10, 25 years, will be very, very difficult for the world to overcome. Coal is growing faster than any other energy source in the developing world. I was recently in a meeting where I learned just in the last few days, actually it was a Wall Street Journal podcast that I was a part of yesterday. There are 1,200 coal plants being built or ready to be built around the world. 1,200. Over the next 10, 20 years. China's still building a coal plant every week to 10 days. There is no shortage of coal. And coal is affordable. And the rest of the world is not following the political correctness of the European Union or the United States or Canada. They could care less what OECD countries do about their energy future. They're going to find their way to economic progress, economic development, just like the OECD did. And if it takes coal, then we'll use coal. And you're talking about societies that do not have a heritage of lawfulness, a heritage of sustainable values. And they will do what they will do. And who's going to stop them? There will not be a global agreement on CO2 management unless the Western OECD countries basically pay the extortion being demanded by the developing world countries. And the American people will never stand for that, even if some of its political leaders might consider it. It'll be like Kyoto. Al Gore signed Kyoto on behalf of the American people. And then the United States voted 99-0 to say to the White House, the sense of the Senate is, we're not going to even embrace a discussion of this treaty. 99 to 0. You get the message, Bill? And the U.S. has yet to have a debate on the Hill about the Kyoto Agreement, and of course it's now expired. So CO2 is a huge issue for us to come to grips with, and if we went to 0 in this country, we have a global problem. Now, I've written that the day of free pollution into the atmosphere has got to come to an end. And I support the technologies that we have and can apply to have 98.6% pollution-free coal plants. It's called Integrated Gasification Combined Cycle, IGCC, where the coal is gasified. And inside the gasifier, all the greenhouse gases are captured and managed systemically to not enter the atmosphere, other than in a disposable fashion, where neither the air nor the water nor the land is impacted, other than the proper land site that has been built, or the disposal well for the liquefied CO2 to be pushed underground as a supercritical liquid. We have that technology, we just simply don't use it. We say it's not affordable. Well, the reason it's not affordable is we don't do it. If we showed ourselves we could do it, and we could replicate it and go to scale, it could quickly become affordable. So I stand for taking all the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and managing them back into the earth from whence they came. Realistically, that's where they came from. Put them back. And we can do that if we choose to. Or we can debate it and argue about it while the world suffers the consequence of too much greenhouse gas. But we can't even have the conversation. I was a strong advocate and served on the United States Climate Action Partnership during my tenure at Shell, which was creating a framework for cap and trade for the nation to embrace. And we gave it to the House of Representatives. They turned it into Waxman-Markey. The Republicans called it cap and tax. And the likelihood of a cap and trade bill for the control or the management, I should say, the downward management of CO2 in the atmosphere, the chance in the next 25 years is dead. And meanwhile, we will continue to put more CO2 into the atmosphere, and if we don't, others will. So we're on a bad path, sad to say, and we'll have a crisis. Sorry.
Our next question.
Question on fuel cells, and could you talk about that and bring it to the point where could a homeowner buy a fuel cell and use it in place of a generator?
There are tens of thousands of fuel cells already in use in the homes in Japan. The answer is yes. A fuel cell can be built that could sit in your garage, your basement, or your patio to provide all the electricity you need with a little natural gas supply. You can make your own electricity. It's part of distributed generation, where the homegrown or the home-based fuel cell can complement the fuel cell in your vehicle. And so a fuel cell, ladies and gentlemen, is a device that chemically converts natural gas or other kinds of inputs to electricity. So it creates electricity in the cell through a chemical reaction. And the fuel cell is becoming more and more affordable because we're learning how to do fuel cells with less and less platinum. And we had a visit, on the Department of Energy's Hydrogen Technology and Fuel Cell Advisory Committee. We brought the whole committee to NREL right here last November to look exactly at what NREL is doing and to, in a sense, give it our blessing as a committee, advisory committee to the Department of Energy and the Secretary of Energy. And it's an amazing story just down the slope here to see what's going on at NREL. And so I think fuel cells have a very bright future. But again, it's probably 2030s, 2040s to commercialize it if we keep going on the path we're on. We could accelerate it, but our former energy secretary, frankly, zeroed the funding for hydrogen fuel cells for mobility when he became energy secretary. That's Stephen Chu. Took us 3 years to get him back in the groove to say, well, I guess we can try. But we went from $200 million a year under George W. Bush to less than $80 million a year, and it was focused on stationary cells, not mobility cells, under Secretary Chu. Now we're back up to 110. So we're still at half the Bush level. And meanwhile, Japan, Germany, and other countries have moved on. And they will have fuel cell vehicles and fuel cells in the home while we, still discuss it, unfortunately. Anyone else?
Yes. I guess I'm still a capitalist, and I don't really think we need energy independence. I mean, from the global standpoint, there's a lot of pluses to having the exchange of trade. Two, I'm trying to figure out, do I vote like a lot of the people in this room? I'm pretty informed, I'm curious, I'm not working anymore, I'm not chasing women. And so I'm just curious, who do I vote for? Do I vote the party or do I vote the person?
Only you can decide that, of course. I personally choose the person. So I voted for Obama in 2008. Sean Hannity asked me on air with 4 million listeners, "You voted for Obama? Why in the world would you vote for Obama?" I said, well, first, I'm a Democrat, so I was inclined that way, and I was a Hillary supporter. "But you voted for Obama. Explain to my listeners why." I said, "Okay, Sean, I will. McCain made me do it." He fell for it. He said, "How could McCain make you vote for Obama?" And I said, quite simple. He chose Sarah Palin. I know Sarah Palin. I worked with her as the governor of Alaska. I was a big fan of hers as governor of Alaska. But for the same reason you don't turn a shortstop into a pitcher overnight, you don't take the governor of Alaska and make her vice president overnight. He said, "Was there any other reason?" I said, "Yeah." He suspended his campaign to focus on the collapse of the financial system in September. And he went to the White House for a meeting and never opened his mouth. So I considered him a dangerous candidate from where I sit. He said, "Well, who are you going to vote for in 2012? I said, "I haven't made up my mind." He said, "Call me when you do." So I called him in September 2012. He put me back on his show. He said, "Who are you going to vote for?" I said, "Romney." He said, "You're going to vote for Romney? Why are you going to vote for Romney?" "Obama made me do it." So, I'm a political scientist, I'm a political junkie. I have my own views. I look at the person. Parties. We were warned against parties, weren't we? By the founders of this country. Yep. I think it was well-placed warning. When you get people like Harry Reid at 20% positive ratings in his own state to run the entire U.S. Senate, I don't think so. The same applies to the other side. Parties are out for parties. Parties are not out for individuals, other than their checks. Parties are about power, not policy. Power, not policy. And perpetuation of power. And so I'm not a party person.
Next question.
Our elected officials are eager to help and are listening for the sound of our voices. But the Supreme Court gave a very large amplifier to the certain voices, those that tend to donate the largest sums. That was a highly partisan court. I suspect that voting is not enough. It seems to me civic initiative and activism is what American participation is about. Now to my question, and that is, what would you say would be the most efficient size of the locus of a distributed energy service or pod, or perhaps to put a different color on it, are there certain forms of distributed energy that work better in large concentrations using the electric grid, and others that work better on smaller levels?
That's a good question. I in fact, going to go back to your comment, agitation and activation, absolutely. That's what I mean by talking to your representatives. When it comes to the size of a distributed, it's all the above. A rancher on a ranch, or a dairy farmer on a dairy farm could be completely independent with distributed generation from a variety of sources, from fuel cells to solar to wind or whatever. But a remote community could be also, or a neighborhood within a community. I live in Houston. NRG is our big utility, and Reliant is the energy company that does the distribution. And I've been to Reliant's experimental distribution center where they test different concepts for distributed generation, and we get hurricanes in Houston. And hurricanes can do a lot of damage to the grid. And in 2008, we had Hurricane Ike. And we had 4 million people without electricity for 2 weeks. It was tough. In September, it was hot. And it was rough on people. But Reliant is working on self-correcting grid systems to divide communities into self-correcting infrastructure. So that if power goes out on one street, that doesn't necessarily have to shut down all of the community, all of the streets nearby. And it could remotely sense what it would take to redistribute electricity to operational lines and just automatically switch switches to move the electricity in a different direction. And so that's all quite possible. So you could have big cities like Houston that could make great use of distributed generation. In fact, Reliant is looking at how to use the gas generators that people have to help keep the system up. Texas has more wind than any other state. Wind power, I should say. And it's making great use of it. We thank you for the wind that comes to Texas, because as the air cools coming down from the high altitudes and it hits the Gulf moisture, we get all of that wind. And it's the daily cooling of the high altitude to low altitude that produces that wind. So we're very grateful for your high plains and your mountains, because it all comes to Texas, or a lot of it comes to Texas. And so we can make a great use of wind in Texas, and so we can do a lot of distributed generation. And Texas actually has certain days of the year where 20% of electricity is coming from wind, which is pretty remarkable. So I think it's whatever size you want.
First of all, thank you for coming this evening and expanding our thoughts on the field of energy. I am a practical person, and I think that your call for us to be activists, not just to think about it, but to do something about the future, demands that we understand, first of all, in a political environment that's increasingly important with town hall meetings coming up, etc. What are 3 things you would be looking for from candidates running for office in this area? 3 things, because they speak in ambiguities and they speak about what people want to hear. And what 3 things could we ask so that we would be on the path of understanding who we're voting for, person or party? Thank you.
I think one very sound question is to ask any member running, or any person running, will you vote the party line, or will you vote as your constituents want you to, and demand that you do? That's a good question. And then hold them to it. And that's the second, can we hold you to it? So will you vote your constituents' views, or will you vote the party line? And will you accept accountability for that, to follow through? And then I think it's a wide range of questions about what do you actually stand for. And if somebody says, well, I'm working on reducing hydrocarbons, that's maybe a noble goal, but we have got to have hydrocarbons for as far as we can see into the future. And somebody might say, well, I'm working on making sure that we control fracking. Well, yeah, that's what regulations are for, to control fracking. Fracking is dangerous business, but fracking can also be successfully done. And the name companies that don't mind having their name in the paper, want to frack the right way. Because they don't want to be seen as cutting corners, skipping best practices. They want to frack in the way in which there is no consequence to their fracking. And that's what the designs do. I mean, you can frack with no consequence if you do it right. And the industry is working as fast as they can on waterless fracking because they recognize this water is precious. And we've got to get to waterless fracking sooner, not later. And there are actually some wells that have been drilled and fracked in some parts of the country, experimental wells, where nitrogen replaces water. Air replaces water. Rocket fuel replaces air or water or whatever, because rocket fuel operates without oxygen. And so there are many different platforms that are being tested because the public has the right to be protected. And the public has the right to expect a regulatory regime at the local and state level, which is where the drilling takes place, that protects the citizens. But these people who want to ban fracking, I consider that as intelligent as banning water systems or not putting fluoride in water. It's a part of life. We need natural gas. We need oil, and the technology works. You know how many wells we drill each year in this country? About 38,000 a year. More than half of those are fracked. So we're fracking nearly 20,000 wells a year. How many do you read about going bad? Almost none. And so the evidence and the weight and the capability is on the side of those who do the fracking, provided they do it right. There was an example out of Pennsylvania that got lost in all of the screaming and shouting over the BP Macondo disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. But there was a Friday night incident in western Pennsylvania 2 or 3 days after the Macondo blew in the Gulf of Mexico, in which 911 got a call, said, there's a well blew at such and such a site. Somebody better go there to do something about it. Well, that call came from one of the staff on his way out of town. So when the first responders got to the site, all the lights are on. You can hear the gas gushing out of the well into the atmosphere, and there's nobody there. Nobody. And so the fire truck says, the people on the fire, what the hell are we supposed to do with this? They'd never trained for a blown well in that community. And the sheriff shows up and says, oh my God, what do we do now? And the ambulance shows up and says, well, you don't need me at the moment. Because there's nobody there. And so it took about, that was 10 o'clock at night. It took about till 2 or 3 in the morning to find out who owns the well. And it's a company in Oklahoma. And it took till 6 a.m. to wake up somebody in Oklahoma. And it took another 4 hours to get somebody from Oklahoma up to Pennsylvania to figure out what are we going to do with this. So you had this well that was emitting a huge amount of methane that didn't make the newspapers, but the crew ran away. That's not good practice. That's not what people are trained to do. But it's obvious they weren't trained. But so we can talk about fracking for a long time. Under the right regulations, with the right responsible companies doing it, I think people have really little to worry about.
Thank you, John Hofmeister, for ending up